I would like to share with you this presentation in order to discuss about how is important and how is allowed to use virtual environments in neuroscience research and in general, and in particular in the assessment of neuropsychological diseases. My starting point is about embodied interaction. What is embodiment and what is embodied space? First of all, okay, if we work on the embodied cognition framework, we put in the center our investigation the body and the activities. And in particular, I worked since the starting of virtual reality on the application of virtual simulation in spatial cognition. So what I'm researching is the idea on how people can explore the environment and build a cognitive organization, a cognitive map of this environment. And if I look at literature that is not specifically tailored on virtual reality and nor specifically tailored on spatial cognition, I find a definition of Jean Rau starting in the 1994 in which he said that perceptual information, any kind of perceptual information, any kind of information we are perceiving now, relevant to the regulation of intentional movement, so this microphone or the laptop that I have here, that includes bodily centered spatial partners, so the idea that I can reach this, changes every time in ways that are lawfully related to the properties of the environment and the action itself. So generally we start from a classical cognitive science approach in which I have a perception and I have the reaction, the movement reaction to this. Jean Rau changes this perspective and say that every time I'm perceiving something, I can't dislink the movement from the perception. So to conceptualize perception and action as a pure independent process is misleading, first of all. And instead it's more parsimonious in terms of cognition to view these two processes as opposite poles of a functional unit of action systems. And this is the idea of embodiment and the evolution of this concept that is in action, the idea that you act in the world by perceiving and in a circular way. In the last 15 years, we have the confirmation of this idea from the mirror neuron discoveries that stresses the strong linkage between perception and action, but they grow. The research on mirror neurons grows up after the Jean Rau definition of perception. They confirm that in some sense, and not only the Jean Rau position, but also the other embodied cognition approach. So accordingly, all the research in the field of intentional action appears to require a reshaping, in some sense, of the concept of interaction. Interaction is not only to do something and to wait the feedback, but becomes something different. And my first main question of research was what we can intend about embodied interaction. In the early 90s, Varela, Thompson, and Eleanor Roche published a book that was titled The Embodied Mind, and they stated that the body becomes an interface between the mind and the world. So it's the body that is the interface, not the interface, the computerized one, and so on. This kind of interaction, this kind of interface, allow, in some sense, to merge the surrounding and the thought, so the mind and the environment. After this position book, they stated that the sensory motor coupling of the organism, even the smallest one, and the environment in which they live, determines recurrent patterns of perception and action that are what they call the enactive knowledge. So every time we do something, we acquire knowledge, we modify the environment, and so on. So the individual perceive the world not in terms of objective and abstract features and objects, but in terms of possible action, effort, and opportunity for action, and every time. And during an action, an agent expects that the environment will react in agreement with the basic relation laws of the body-environment interaction that we call the invariants of the physical world. When I move, I'm expecting that the environment will remain in some sense related to my body. And this coupling depends on the encounter of the characteristic of the two poles, the body and the environment in interaction, and shapes all our activity and all our perception, and reshape every time, if I change my objective, the idea on how I can explore and how I can use this environment. So the agent's management of an action depends strictly on the creation and on the maintenance of the movement-by-movement reactivation of these sensory motor schemes. Both proprioceptive information from the body and from the both from the information from the external world. We can't dislink these two poles. So the idea is that the coupling between the egocentric embodied perception and the environment is easy to understand when we live in a natural environment. But what happens when we explore virtual environments that are simulation of the environment that we perceive in a not so full sensory way, okay? We use some eyeglasses and so on, and we don't have all these embodied feedback from the environment. So this was my main research questions, and as I told you, I don't have the real answer on this, but I would like to explore. So the unrevealed question is, for me, virtual reality simulation now and in the last 15 years were largely used in neuroscience and were largely used in assessing cognitive abilities in patients and in healthy subjects. And in particular, in spatial organization, were largely used in order to evaluate wayfinding abilities and spatial abilities within, for example, neuroscans and neuroimaging techniques, because we can't move inside, but we can watch and move on a joystick, and they can map our brain activities and conclude something that generally is generalized and extended to wayfinding in natural environment. Is that correct? First of all, we worked a lot with Silvia and with Giuseppe in the last years with the virtual simulation for spatial cognition. But I think it's a little bit a good idea to ask us, first of all, and to the other, if it's reasonable to obtain the same conclusion about spatial cognition for our research, but in general for cognition, from classical, obtainable from classical neuropsychological tests and virtual reality simulation. Can I conclude something about the classical cognition if I'm using virtual reality simulation in assessing this cognition? Or there are many differences for spatial knowledge acquisition provided from the simulation characteristic per se that we have strongly considered in our research. So this is my big question now. Which is the difference between navigating a real environment and navigating a virtual one? If I would like to adopt, and I would like to adopt the enactive perspective that I described with you before, to virtual reality interaction, I need to reconsider what are the characteristics of the coupling between the agent and this environment, because the environment is different from the classical one. And it implies that I have to deeply define the link that will involve reciprocal modification between them. I modify the virtual environment according to the movement on a joypad and so on. So it's a different kind of interaction that I have with my body, and the environment has a different characteristic. This is not my original question. Is a question that Mélédouard in 2006 asked to the scientific community. Even if in a virtual reality environment we are able to interact by choosing, appropriating affordances, opportunities for action according to our embodied perception of the environment, we gain information from a peculiar sensory motor coupling with the joypad and so on, in order to support us in creating representation of the words and in terms of body and environment invariance. So the experiential difference that I obtain in this sense between the navigation of the simulated environment and the navigation of an environment that is not simulated might influence my spatial cognition. In some sense, I can acquire some kind of spatial cognition in virtual reality environments and a different kind of this in a natural one. So I start to talk, to think about what to compare. And in the last years with Giuseppe and the colleagues of the Istituto Auxologico, we developed here a virtual simulation of a classical neuropsychological test. One of the main tests used for assessing with neuropsychological patients orientation in a complex environment. That is the Money roadmap test. It's a test in which you have to follow this pathway and tell to the experimenter, to the clinician, which kind of turn you have to do in order to reach the next landmark. So if you are here, you say, I'm turning on the right, here I'm turning again on the right, here I'm turning on the left, and so on. It's a very simple test if you have a good spatial cognition ability. And it requires you to imagine the right-left turning and to explore this environment that you are looking from the above. So in what we define the survey perspective. If you construct this city in virtual reality, you have another kind of test. And generally, people use that as equivalence, and I'm not so convincing of that, because if you use a 3D version of the same environment, you have to choose actively your right and left turn, and you have a body-centered perspective. And in fact, I compare it with the 61 healthy subjects from 30 to 80 years old, the two environments. So you can see here the differences for young adults from 30 to 49 years old. So in some sense, digital native and accustomed to use joypads and so on and computer screens. Here there are the differences between 15 with the adult 15 and 64 years old, and here the difference with the old adult, the over 65 years old. And you can see that we have a lot of difference between the two simulations, the classical one and the virtual one, but also between the age groups. So it confused a lot our possible conclusions. They are all trained to use virtual reality. Okay, I excluded the patient subject who doesn't have the possibility to move, and in the environment we had a lot of tests of usability before to release that. So we, in some sense, trying to eliminate some interfering variables. These are data strictly linkable to the performance on the virtual environment. And the questions appear to be more complex because, there is a difference between, for example, imaging a right-left turn on a body axis, as they do in the classical roadmap test, and performing it in order to obtain a special perspective from the simulated world. They have to act inside. In the classical, in the Money roadmap test, an agent first look at the map, okay, and then imagine how to move on the body axis, and finally obtain and have to keep in mind the spatial perspective derived from the turn. In the virtual reality version, an agent first look at the map and then physically turn on the body axis and finally perceive in the simulated world the spatial perspective derived from that turn. And as they provide different embodied affordances, might they result in different orientation outcomes? Specifically, this difference, due to the peculiar sensory-motor coupling they provide, will be evidenced by the type of turns made by the participant and the increasing complexity of the increasing complexity of the right-left turn. When the turns become harder and more difficult, they appears to be more confused. I analyzed the type of turns, and I can conclude that. I try to conclude with you, and I open the discussion after my sort of conclusion that I have after this. Navigating in a virtual space appears to be more complex than navigating in other kind of simulated space, the natural one included. Moreover, this difficulty seems to be directly correlated with the environment complexity and with the increasing of age. Why? My first answer was our own body is experienced from the inside, and the space around our body does not depend on the physical situation per se, but as Barbara Tresky said, from the coupling between the inside and the environment, my proprioception and the environment. Maybe during navigation, agents have to match the perspective that the scenario is providing them to their right-left turn intentions in order to match the obtained perspective with the result of each turn. And this matching had to be tightly coupled with the internal cognitive process. But it's not a conclusion, really. Maybe we have to think more about it, and I try to do. So if, as by using ICT solution, I offload cognition on the external, because virtual reality show me what I have done, the conclusion of my movement. So the option of offloading cognition on the external visualization that virtual reality can provide me by observing the perspective from the right-left turn I have done, seems to require more effort to base it on the embodied imaginative process that I can have only by saying I'm turning right, I'm turning left, and I don't need to check if I'm right and what I'm seeing. So the interpretation of this data could be consistent with what Di Paolo said about an action and about the necessity to have an indistinguishable dialectic mechanism of monitoring the regulation of poles that supports the creation of a meaningful situation and a meaningful perspective of an organism. So for an agent that is involved in a virtual reality simulation, maybe is misleading to have not the possibility to create this meaningful situation, maybe for a breakdown of the present, for the difficulty of reorient in a small, an environment that is perceived as very small. So accordingly, in a virtual reality simulation here, in the virtual reality simulation of the roadmap test, by perceptually offloading cognition and offloading the turn response of my action without involving the whole embodiment, the whole embodied information that I normally have in moving in a natural space, can have created in some sense, a meaningful experience or a less meaningful experience for agents. And this failure of this decrease in the sensory motor coupling, in the sense that an active cognition, say to us, can be perceived as a useless for the agent and for spatial orientation in general. So, in conclusion, what are the warnings that I would like to discuss with you? First of all, that we need to, before to introduce virtual reality simulation in the assessment of cognitive function and in spatial cognition in particular, we have to have a correct usability process and to introduce some solution for the breakdowns that people can have in the environment. And it is the entry level that we have. But moreover, I think that we need to integrate virtual reality with the traditional evaluation methods and not substitute that, specifically for spatial cognition. Because you can have an interesting alternative to the paper and pencil test, but of course you can have some different results that you can't generalize to the natural wayfinding ability that people have. So maybe to do a lot of research by introducing virtual reality in neuroimaging studies is not really a good idea without a comparison with a natural environment or a classical study, I think. And I would like to share with you all those questions and so on in the discussion.